We're very thrilled that you can join us for today's exciting and very timely discussion on environmental crisis, development, and human rights in South Asia. The format for today's event will be approximately 30 minutes of presentation by each of our guest lecturers, followed by approximately 30 minutes of a moderated Q&A. During the presentations, you can drop your questions into the chat or into the Q&A, and you can do that during or after the presentation, and we'll monitor those as you enter them. We also ask that all participants help us to create a safe virtual space for learning and exchange, and engage respectfully and professionally with the speakers and other participants in the chat. The Center for South Asia reserves the right to remove any disruptive participants from today's event. Following the workshop, we will send out a resource packet to all registered attendees with book bundles shipping out to registered educators on a first come, first served basis. And with that, I would like to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Shobhana Chelliah, who is a distinguished research professor of linguistics at the University of North Texas. Her research focuses on the documentation of the Tibeto-Burman languages of Northeast India. She's currently partnering with national and academic institutions in India to grow the computational resource for South Asian languages, CORSAL, which I would encourage you to check out the website for that at the University of North Texas. That is a language archive for South Asian languages. Her publications include a grammar of Meitei, also known as Manipuri, and the Handbook of Descriptive Linguistic Fieldwork, as well as Why Language Documentation Matters. Dr. Chelliah has served as a program officer and expert for the National Science Foundation, and she is a recipient of several NSF awards, as well as fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, American Institute of Indian Studies, American Council for Learned Societies, and the Fulbright Program. Today, her presentation will focus on addressing human rights and climate concerns through language documentation. Following her presentation, Dr. Deepa Badrinarayana will give a presentation. She is a professor of law at Fowler School of Law, Chapman University, where she teaches seminars in international law, international environmental law, climate change, as well as the 1L torts class. Her scholarship focuses primarily on climate change and environmental law, with emphasis on international law dimensions, human rights, trade, and environmental justice, areas in which she has published and delivered papers on regularly. Prior to teaching at Chapman, Professor Badrinarayana worked at Columbia University School of Law, where she was a visiting scholar at the Center on Global Legal Problems, an associate in the law teaching program, and research assistant to Professor Frank P. Grad. In India, Professor Badrinarayana was a research officer in a World Bank Government of India project on environmental capacity building, and a founding team member of the Center on Environmental Education, Research, and Advocacy. In her role as research officer, she engaged in advocacy, consultation, and training work for lawmakers, judges, educators, and businesses. Professor Badrinarayana holds a doctorate and a master's degree in environmental law from Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law, Pace University, as well as a bachelor's in law with honors from the National Law School in India, Bangalore. Her presentation will focus today on a colonial perspective on human rights, introductory insights from British India. And then finally, our third panelist, Thomas Crowley, is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Geography at Rutgers University. He's spent over a decade researching and writing about environmental politics and history in India. From 2010 to 2016, he conducted intensive research on the Delhi Ridge for the NGO Intercultural Resources, as well as for the Chelliah Studio Fellowship Program at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. His book, Fractured Forest, Quartzite City, A History of Delhi and its Ridge, was published by Yoda Press Sage Select in 2020. Crowley completed a Fulbright scholarship at the University of Pune from 2008 to 2009 and served as a social science fellow at the Akademie Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart, Germany from 2016 to 2017. He's written extensively on Indian politics for Jacobin magazine. He has also written for Kafila as well as for peer-reviewed academic journals, including CAST, a global journal on social exclusion and emotion space and ecology. He currently lives in Maharashtra and is researching the politics of water, caste, and memory in small-town India. Thomas Crowley's presentation today will focus on Beyond Pristine Glory, the Long History and Uncertain Future of the Delhi Ridge. And with these introductions, please help me give a warm CSA welcome to our panelists. We'll start with Dr. Chelliah.
Thank you so much for this invitation and this exciting opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the others on the panel. Sounds it's going to be a great afternoon. I am pleased to talk to you a little bit about my work and how it interacts with the topic for today. So I'm a language documenter. And so a lot of times people don't know what that is. Language documentation is a subfield of linguistics, and it's sort of a reaction to this alarming trend that many of the world's languages are disappearing or are going silent because speakers are in new environments where they are either not encouraged to speak or are actively discouraged to speak their traditional languages. And for both scientific reasons as well as for humanistic reasons, linguists have responded to this by saying that we must urgently gather information about these languages and their cultures, both for the sake of the speakers, so they can be connected to their past and assert their identities and have those connections move on to the future, as well as for the information that is in those languages. And that's something that we're going to talk about today, which is the environment, right? So, and how these languages might give us new ways of understanding environment. So language documentation then for India is incredibly important because we know that there are so many languages spoken in India. And so creating a lasting record of those languages, especially in terms of using new technologies to do so, creating digital resources for those languages. So language documentation marries an older art of describing languages with technologies to create these kinds of digital resources for language so that they can be accessed into perpetuity. And so that's what language documentation does. And what we have found in India is because of the many different languages and the many different numbers of speakers and resources that are put towards their description, there's sort of an unevenness so that the larger languages have more work done on them, and the smaller languages are really struggling to catch up and are very much in danger of being lost because there's nothing written down and speakers are starting to speak some of the larger languages rather than their mother tongues. So we have several different language families. I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but I have it in my PowerPoint if you'd like to look at that. So the Dravidian language family is spoken in the southern part, Indo-Aryan, which is about 70% of India anyway, speaks an Indo-Aryan language with millions of speakers speaking Hindi, and smaller Indo-Aryan languages also exist. For example, Assamese, which is spoken here in the northeastern part, has about 13 to 14 million speakers. So that's considered a small language. So you can imagine there are languages, and I've actually given you a chart here of the different Indo-Aryan languages. Konkani would be considered a small language with the 2 million speakers. But there are even smaller languages with 50,000 speakers, for example, and they would belong to families such as the Munda family, which is an Austroasiatic family from the Austroasiatic branch. And you can go to this website, the livingtongues.org website, and read a lot about these Munda languages. I think you'll find it interesting. There was a documentary done called The Linguists, and Greg Anderson, who is one of the founders of Living Tongues, stars in that film. So that's another really good one to watch in your student group if you're interested in language study. But they do a lot with these Munda languages, and there the languages are quite small, 50,000 or so. I focus on the languages of the Tibeto-Burman family, and these are spoken through this swath across the Himalayas. And then my focus is here in the Assam and Manipur area, which is sort of sandwiched between Bangladesh and Myanmar or Burma. And here in these languages, there are about 250 to 260 languages. We don't really know the number because we keep discovering that sometimes a language which was called one is actually two or three, but they were kind of lumped together at some point because only now are we describing and understanding these languages. Here, you'll find some languages have only 300 to 500 speakers. So you can see that there's an ecology which has helped those languages exist for many generations with 5,000, 4,000, 3,000, maybe just a 500 or 300 speakers. But as that ecology shifts and moves, then the preservation of where those languages can be spoken is really, really precarious, because then even a small shift may mean that they will start speaking a larger language or a language that is more prevalent, say like in education. So this is where I do most of my work in Manipur State. And in Manipur State, there are 30 different languages spoken. One of them is 1.5 million speakers, and some of them have like 200 speakers. So there's yet another language family, the Andamanese, which is a very, very interesting family in the Nicobar and Andamanese Islands. But this chart here kind of gives you an idea of the imbalance or the reality of the kind of digital resources and other resources, paper resources available for the languages in India. Most of the languages, have, so SL stands for scheduled languages. These are the recognized languages of India, and the dialects of these languages. As you go down this little cake here, as you go to the base of the cake, you have more and more languages, but the number of resources are highest at the top. So for most of the languages of India, where we have 10,000 speakers or less, we have very few resources. That means no TV, no kind of newspapers, no textbooks, and sometimes, very often, no writing system yet. So there is a need for digital resources in order to assure the longevity of that language. So what we do in language documentation is we use technology to create those resources. So we train our students, and nowadays we also train a lot of native speakers who are interested in doing this work for their communities in the use of video and audio recording. I never thought I'd have to learn about WAV versus MP3 formats or where to place a microphone and all of this, but this is standard stuff that linguists learn when they go out to do language documentation. And we also have many students who are interested in app creation for this kind of recording by native speakers themselves. Then once things are recorded, we also have to train our students as well as now native speakers on how they might manage that data. Data management and data archiving are a very integral part of language documentation, because we collect oodles of like stories and conversations, and then when we talk to people about those, so like interpretive things from those digital sources. So the derivative files also need to be named correctly and then brought into some sort of collection so that you can then do further analysis, or even just make it available for speakers to get on their phones. So if they want to listen to grandma telling a story, how do they find it? What's the metadata, and how can they then access it correctly on or easily through through devices that they have. So we train people also to do transcription and translation. So these are freely available software that we use, and each of them require a little bit of different proficiencies, but they're not difficult for people to learn. So we're really excited about the fact that both academic language documenters and non-academic language documenters now exist and can use these tools. A lot of times they have to also learn to use keyboards, and there are now freely available ways of typing, say in Devanagari or other anything that really has Unicode can now be used with these different layouts. And there are software for also segmenting, what we call time aligning the speech signal with the transcription. And this is very important because the more we can do this, the more we can automatically transcribe, and the more we can try to build digital resources like voice recognition systems for languages. And so people can do things like bank with their phones with their own language. And finally, the final piece of software that I think is very interesting is one that takes a piece of language that you really don't know anything about and helps you then build an analysis system of it by breaking the language up into different words and then into different morphemes or pieces of words and assigning meaning to those and looking for predictive rules. Once we understand those rules, then we can build ways of teaching people how to use that language and build pedagogical materials about that language. So there's software for that too. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we do as language documenters. And doing that, then we're able to also build things like dictionaries with pictures and words and so on. So some people are really focused on dictionary making for their languages. So what the last kind of piece of this is the archiving piece. And that's something that I've been really working a lot on recently. The CORSAL, the Computational Resource for South Asian Languages, is something that we've developed here at the University of North Texas. And we're sort of open doors. If you have language information that you want to archive with us and start creating collections for your language, we are here to do that. And we have all different types of documenters. This is a linguist, Tangi Changte. She had materials from her, it was like from her uncle who was writing letters back home. And when he was studying in the ministry here in the United States in the 50s and 60s, so there were cassette tapes, and so she brought them, they were like letters home. And then the folks back home in Mizoram, which is in Northeast India, would write back audio. And so we have digitized all of those, and it's very precious kind of older forms of naturalistic speech of Mizo. So that's one example, all the way to, community collectors, and people who are actual students who are welcomed to deposit with us. And we're trying to train them in metadata creation that's like, taking all of your digital files and actually naming them correctly and getting them ready to be archived. So CORSAL is kind of a mediated archiving experience with our student curators helping people develop their collections here. And we do a lot of training in India, and I spent a few months this semester, in the spring semester, working in India, kind of going around about CORSAL and giving them training in the different things that I mentioned earlier on, recording and using of the software and so on. I really believe very strongly that language documentation matters. I wrote this little Springer brief, and I've actually put a copy of this in the shared drive. So please feel free to read as much of that and send me questions, send me your responses on that. I think that language documentation has the potential to shift young people's minds in terms of their identity and their self-worth and their connections to the world as it is. If you're not connected with your community and your community history, you're a little bit lost. And it really seems to, I've seen studies now in Native American contexts and in Canada, which show that students who are connected in language and culture classes have better outcomes in school. There are lower rates of suicide that have been noticed in Canada for people who are deeply involved in their language work. And so we have a feeling that this really matters. And I also have, in this book, sort of talked about different case studies where communities have worked together with linguists to document their languages and have reported, positive results. This is actually a big study that's waiting to be done, how to actually look at these. There's anecdotal information and only few studies that have been done. A lot more could be done to show correlation between language and culture, revitalization and connection for youth, and social well-being. But because of this belief and because of a lot of my students are really interested in, I've been working with various people in Northeast India specifically in Manipur state, in revitalizing and working on their languages. And I would like to tell you a little bit about some specific things that I've been doing that are related to today's goals that have to do with environment and human rights. So languages really kind of can express the way that human beings refer to their immediate environment, and they do it in sometimes surprisingly different ways. Like for all of us, we all the time will talk about the location of items. We may not think that we're doing it, but nowadays, now that you've heard me say that, maybe you will think of it. So, you know, I might tell you the pen is on the table, or the pen is to the right of the book, or it's right in front of you, or you need to turn left to get to the bank, right? But this is not the same in all languages. We've discovered that although we think that languages and the way that people think is very, very similar, when we start looking at languages in detail, we find some surprising, some expected similarities, and then some surprising things that are different. And that's why it's so important for us to go out and document these languages before the information is gone. In terms of topography, in terms of environment and locating an environment, I just wanted to give you one example of the difference. So there are a couple of different ways in which people refer to things. You can do it in this relative frame of reference for expressing location. And we do that in English, like the fork is to the left of the spoon. But there's another way, which is which we find in Australia, and we find in hilly terrain. So these are like absolute ways of referring to things. So if you're looking at you know, a bush or a snake in the language Gugu-Yimidir, for example, which is a language of Australia, you would not say that it is near your foot or to the right of your foot. You'd say it's to the east of your foot or the west of your foot. There are, or south or north. And I think I have a diagram here somewhere, or maybe I've left it out, but it's sort of with the cardinal, you know, the magnetic north, south, east, west, north and south. It's just a tiny little bit off where those north, south, east, and west directions refer to. But so you would really be talking in terms of things as east of, or you may be like east very close by, east far away, or it could be also east over a certain obstacle. So there are different ways of referring to location, always using this absolute direction, and then also using the distance from where you're speaking. So I think I provide an example here in an actual sentence. So you get an example of how linguists look at languages. They break them into these words. The words are then broken into their different parts. You see, you have the word for you, the word for bushfire, the word for burn, along with this morpheme that means do it, or it's an imperative. It's giving it a kind of direction. And then this directional, which tells you which direction from. This little display here is called an interlinear gloss, and it's something that all linguists aspire towards creating, because it really then gives you the nitty-gritty of the details of the language. And then from that, you can walk backwards and say, oh, I see. These guys, when the Gugu-Yimidirs, when they talk about direction, they use this east form, and it's this particular type of east form rather than one of the other ones that we have seen here. So interlinear gloss text is something that linguists use to understand the details of language. So another way of looking at directions is this uphill and downhill axis. And that's what they do in a lot of places in Northeast India, because they live in hilly terrain. So rather than saying, come home, come to dinner, they will say, come up to dinner, or come down to dinner, depending on where the speaker and the listener are. You can't just say, come to dinner. You have to say, when you use a directional or emotional verb, you have to say in which direction, and it's the up and down axis that is used. So languages can encode these physical realities of where people live, and they can orient the way that people think about items in certain different ways. And there are people who study this kind of different cognitive orientations depending on how languages do play terms of reference. So I invite you to maybe look up some of that. And there are people who work on terms of reference and very, very interesting kind of psychological, psycholinguistic, we call them, experiments that are done to play with that, to understand how people actually think about their environment. So let me just talk also about taxonomy, because one of the things that we're realizing is that Western science does taxonomy, or understanding of environment, understanding of animals, plants, in a different way sometimes. So when we talk about taxonomy, we're talking about classifying and naming things based on a hierarchical structure. So I don't know if I had to memorize that, like, I don't know, King Philip came over from Greater Spain, like kingdom, phylum, blah, 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 right? So that division is how we kind of draw trees and say, okay, this particular insect falls into this category and is related then upward to these different larger and larger categories and structures. But that may not be the only way that things can be named or things can be understood. And as we start looking at the way that languages and different communities look at flora and fauna, different types of natural things in the environment, we see that there are different ways of understanding or categorizing. And those ways of categorizing can be very revealing about how communities interact with those different items in the environment. So they may have things like where they exist or how they related to the usage. And I have an example of that here. This is from Arizona, actually, from the United States in Arizona, work done by Carrie Cannon and others from the Pi community, which are several different related languages which have the word Pi in them, Hualapai, Havasupai, and so on. But in this project that they did, they looked at different words for different kinds of cacti and other kinds of agave, all the different kinds of things that were used in culinary and birds and other things in the environment. And they found, for example, that the way that things were named had to do, like, for example, this prickly pear cactus was named in terms of who ate that. And so there's deer fruit and buzzard fruit and jackrabbit fruit and cottontail fruit and chicken hawk fruit. These were categorized in a different way than we would think of in Latinate terms. So by having this information, then we can track back and see, okay, if there's a word for buzzard fruit left in the language, but no buzzard fruit exists now, then we can see that there has been a loss of that kind of fruit in the environment. So studying what's in a language today can show us what changes have happened to the environment. But we have to really look at how these different languages have built these taxonomies. And this is not just for example, if we just saw that there was a random word for deer fruit, we may not think to find out what other kinds of words are there for the things that animals eat. Once we've made our extended lists, then we can then go back and see, well, which one of these are now missing from the environment, and why are they missing, and what changes have happened to the environment because of that. So language documentation can lead to an understanding of environmental change in this way. And we're very excited to bring this information to geographers, to environmental specialists, to help with a different way of understanding language, a different way of understanding environmental change. One of the things that we have noticed is that people who study environmental change are now looking at first-person narratives. And they're saying, when we talk to people about how they have experienced loss or gain of ecosystems has affected their lives, they learn more about that loss or gain. And they also see more of a connection, that people are more sort of interested in that loss or gain. So sometimes, just things go bad, it gets really hot. We don't notice that the world is, getting hotter and hotter. But when you have a first person kind of almost like contemplative thinking about it and they give you a first person narrative, it seems like people are also more engaged in understanding more about the environment. Well, it turns out that linguists do a lot of first person narrative collection. They do story collection, like traditional stories, but they also collect first person narratives, because in first person narratives, you get a lot of language information that is different from stories. In stories, it's a lot like it's often what we call third person. It's like, you know, the coyote did this or the rabbit did that. And it's all about that other person. So all of the verbs and everything else will have to do with the third person. The first person one, like I did this or I did that, you're going to get different kinds of language that go on in those first person narratives. So we think that by collecting first person narratives and asking the right questions, we can contribute a lot to the understanding of language, of environmental change. For example, we would like to engage in questions where we ask people about what were things like then and what are they like now. We can ask about things like, tell us about how your family used to do shifting cultivation, where like in Northeast India, a lot of times people will do rice cultivation in one place and then they'll move to another hill and do rice cultivation there the next year, versus terrace cultivation. How have things changed between using animals to plow versus using a machine to plow, and so on. And also things about traditional songs and dances, festivals and feasts at harvest. There used to be, you know, songs that had things about predicting what crops are going to be successful. Some of these things are lost and some of these things are still around. So what communities want is to preserve that old information. And what we see is that you can double dip and get even better, bang for your buck by doing that kind of preservation and understanding of those old things, by doing what the community really needs, which is they would like to save that information. And then we can also then learn about these different changes to the environment. All right. There is a question in the Q&A. Is it for me? Okay. We will read that in a little while. I will be working with somebody who uses WhatsApp, and this is another very powerful kind of way that community members are sharing information with each other. So my friend and a collaborator, Rex Kular, who is from the Lamkang community of Chandel district of Manipur state, speaks the language Lamkang, and he will send us pictures of plants, and he loves plants, and he looks up the common name. He looks up the Assamese name. He knows them, sometimes has the Manipuri name. He gives us the Lamkang name and when he took it. And all of this can be downloaded and then archived for future use. And we think this kind of citizen science documenting environment dovetails so well with language documentation that more and more linguists are working on in that area. I'm just going to check the time. I think I'm on my last topic here. And I believe I'm a few minutes over. So I'm just going to say that we know also that there are a lot of things like dams that are being built in these areas, people who are forced to move for different reasons. And we're also looking at using language documentation and first-person narratives to learn about the effects of things like forced migration or relocation because of the creation of dams. Similarly, what we're doing is talking to people about political conflict and first-person narratives and how their language has changed, their life has changed. And this really has to do with the human rights part of it. I know that this panel is probably the nexus between environmental change and human rights. But in fact, we find that there's a connection between the loss of language and human rights. Loss of language has been seen as a type of impingement of a human right. And you can look up that language preservation is a human right. It's a UNESCO statement about language rights. And so we're also involved in studies that, and I put a paper about this, by the way, in our readings, where we're looking at about how language documenters can use first-person narratives to understand better the trauma that people undergo in minoritized communities and how that affects their language and their ability to connect with their cultures and their traditional ways of life. So in that packet, you can also read about these different case studies that we have put up. So I will not go through these in detail, but there are several people who talk about this in those first-person narrative terms. This is what I've undergone. This is how language has been affected through these political conflicts, and why it's important for us to be documenting those more. So what we'd like to say is we should tell the story that is not told, and that linguists can help to do that. There are ethical questions, there are risk factors, there are many things that need to be discussed, but this is where we think we can contribute. And that is where I will end. I think my time is up, but what I would like to say is that in the readings, I've also included some information where I have been thinking along with my colleagues about how information about endangered languages can be included in the undergraduate curriculum, but definitely adapted for a high school curriculum. And I've also put in an activity that we used with our high school and middle schoolers summer camp, where they created their own language and learned about linguistic structure through that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Chelliah, for such an important contribution to this discussion. We will hold, I see we do have some questions in the Q&A. We're going to hold all the questions until the end. So we will get to that following all presentations. And I will now turn the mic over to Professor Deepa Badrinarayana for her presentation.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. I think we may need to change the screen share. Oh, no, you're not doing a screen, right?
Right. No, I'm not doing a screen. So bear with me. Thank you for that. First of all, let me start by thanking Professor Beckman for inviting me to participate in this, fantastic and timely panel. I think it's a topic that is not just timely, but also, one that I'm very happy to note coincides with the 50th year anniversary of the Stockholm Conference and the Stockholm Declaration. And so it's really a great pleasure to be talking today, on this panel. And I was absolutely fascinated and, really taken by Dr. Chelliah's presentation just now. And in some ways, it kept on reflecting. I mean, it made me reflect about a common theme that I have been thinking about in the context of law itself and British, colonization of India, which is how the language of the law changed over a period of time in India. So you have this whole idea of, of law and the way the entire, I won't even say the country, but different parts of the country treated law in different contexts, cultural contexts, and how it got overtaken by this Anglo-Saxon common law jurisprudence, and how all the evolution of the rights, all the evolution of, the decolonization movement and the legal system itself changed. And the law of the law and the language was a very different language than what was prevalent historically. But I'll come to that in a minute and mention that in passing. But I just wanted to point out, that this is a nice segue, to my own presentation. And I was really heartened to hear Dr. Chelliah's presentation on the importance of language. So what I'd like to do today is, talk about, or my presentation will have three main parts. The first part will really discuss the present, right? I want to focus on South Asia and the present conditions in South Asia very briefly. I would then like to move on to the future and kind of talk about briefly the challenges and opportunities that South Asia has, in the near future. And finally, I'd like to kind of connect the two with the past and talk about, how the past can actually inform future laws, policies, and ways of thinking about different issues in South Asia, specifically with regard to environmental crises, and in particular within that climate change. So to begin off, South Asia, of course, I always go and look this up, like what are the countries in South Asia? What is South Asia? And there are different lists, but I think a common list usually includes Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And that is South Asia for us. And South Asia is like almost like this, right? You can see this is how you can say by India, that's South Asia. Now, all of these countries in South Asia are very diverse, very distinct culturally, but also they occupy about 3.5% of the world's land surface. So it's not a very big part of the world, 3.5% of the land surface of the world. And still the GDP is about a 4.8 trillion US dollars right now, which I thought was, just remembering some of the figures I'd seen in the past, that's quite a, shift, in the GDP. And the per capita income nominally is about $2,000 per capita, GDP, sorry, per capita GDP. So this is kind of like a quick snapshot statistically of the region. But when it comes to what about the blood and the flesh of South Asia, it's a region that is, of course, marked by great challenges. So for instance, we've all probably been reading in the news about Sri Lanka, and it's probably the one country where we can see a lot of crisis unfolding. But the reality is that many of these regions, most of them, I think all of them, developing nations, have big challenges. And some of the big challenges that they face are primarily with respect to development, poverty, access to basic infrastructure, water, electricity, and food, right? So these are some of the basic challenges that still define many of the countries, or almost all the countries in South Asia. And as they confront these challenges, what we are seeing is an increase in energy use, right? So the kind of developmental model that they have adopted over the past couple of decades require a lot of intensive energy use. They mirror the kind of developmental models that are out there, that are predominantly Western in their context. And it's not something that many countries or even many peoples can comment against, because how does one reconcile the fact that I can say you don't need as much electricity when I have all the electricity, but you are not supposed to get it because it will cause environmental crisis. So in other words, South Asia really is defined by many contradictions, the challenges that are present on the one hand of developmental needs, and on the other hand, the environmental problems that those developmental policies will create pretty much define South Asia in regard to the environmental crisis today. So this is our present challenge, right? So how are countries meeting these present challenges? So what countries are doing, and I'm going to focus on India, right, at this point, because I come from India and I have a little bit of expertise in India. So I don't want to talk about other countries in which I have no expertise. But in terms of India, when you look at all the statistics with respect to climate change, it's about, I think, the third largest energy consumer and emitter of greenhouse gases. It's at least in the top 5 greenhouse gas emitters in the world. But at the same time, India's GDP is nowhere close to that of many of the countries which have high greenhouse gas emissions. Consider United States, consider China. While India has doubled its energy consumption by almost, has doubled its energy consumption since 2000, which is a big jump in its energy consumption, and 80% of which comes from coal, oil, and biomass. It's still not one of the largest emitter of greenhouse gases on that comparative scale, on an absolute scale, perhaps. And two, if you look at India's Human Development Index, and I think this is all in the folders that I have distributed, India is not ranked very high in terms of its Human Development Index. It's about 130, its rank is about 130 out of 160 something countries, for about 200 countries, which is pretty low. And if you think about this country, which has which is one of the fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and you look at the Human Development Index, there's a big a big gap between the two. So India is in this really difficult position where on the one hand, it needs to develop. On the other hand, it also is one of the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, which on a global scale puts it in an even more awkward position. So if you had to compare India to, say, Bangladesh or Maldives, you would say, well, shouldn't India be scaling back? So India right now, at the very present, has really critical challenges in terms of managing its energy use, development policies, and managing its environmental crisis. And despite all of this progress that has been made in India, one of the key challenges is that India itself is highly vulnerable to climate change. I don't know if some of you were following this in the news, but I think it was in June, there was this huge heat wave in Delhi when all the crops pretty much died, right? The beginning of the cropping season in New Delhi, well, for wheat, pretty much was a failure because of the sudden heat wave. And moreover, farmers are not able to any longer farm in the heat because of the increased heat. So there are really important contradictory challenges facing India, and the future does not look very, very secure, to the extent that even as India will continue to grow and its energy consumption will increase and infrastructure development will improve. There's way more electricity available to people now. I was in India in June, and every time I go back to India, I can, without the proper statistical documentation, I can visually see the changes. It's very different from the India I left. You can see the kind of developments that are, that have taken place at such a massive pace. It's unbelievable. And at the same time, there are some things that remain unchanged, right? And mainly the unchanged part of the infrastructure challenges. So when you look at the future of India, the question really that comes back to that comes to us is, well, what is India going to do? How is India going to manage its development needs, but at the same time make sure that all the vulnerability that its people will face with respect to increased temperatures, with respect to water scarcity, in respect to flooding that will occur in some of the regions, how is India going to manage all of these problems? And what role has India played globally to make sure that it straddles the two in an effective manner? Right, so that's kind of the question that remains for the future. And even though India has pledged to reduce its emissions and go more towards clean energy by 2040, and much has been done in that direction, we are still not in the clear when it comes to the question of, has India made itself secure both in terms of its economic position and its future environmental position? And I think India continues to be in an extremely vulnerable position with respect to both. And a recent report on India's environmental performance released by Yale University, and I think it's also available on in the materials, shows that India has dropped significantly in its performance. Now, there have been certain questions raised about how the index performance, or how the performance was measured, and there were some changes in the metrics. Nevertheless, there have been some challenges that have been brought to the fore, and there are consistent reports out there that show that India has a big, for instance, air pollution problem. That mortality rates in India are documented to consistently go down because of the air pollution problem. So this is the future that we are looking at, a country where there might be increased wealth, but there still will be environmental problems. And add to that a final layer, which has consistently plagued, I think, many developing countries, which is the poverty gap. So in terms of economic distribution, so wealth creation is one part of the story, but wealth distribution is an entirely another part of the story. And the wealth distribution part of the story still remains a challenge. We do have deep differences in terms of who are the consumers of high energy projects and who are the consumers of all the benefits of development and who are left with the burdens that are created by all these development projects, including the environmental crises that are going to affect low-income communities and specifically also affect, for instance, indigenous communities in India. So when we look at the future, we might see a wealthier nation, but will we see a more just nation? Right. So these are some of the challenges that we will probably encounter not so far in the future. So the question is, of course, the trillion-dollar questions. Nobody's dealing with the millions anymore. Is what do we do about this? And this is not a question that is new. This is not a question that has not been asked. It's a question that has been asked repeatedly in the history of the world itself, in different parts of the world. What do we do? And so my work with respect to climate change really focused or came from the point of my Indian experience or my experience in India, trying to understand how does one begin to, think through these issues in a way that is meaningful for a country that faces these dual challenges of developmental needs and environmental crisis happening at the same time, not in sequence. And so that led me to kind of look at how is India negotiating at the international level with respect to climate change. So a couple of years back, I think around 1997, early 2000, when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, India and China emerged as two countries that occupy the center of this entire emissions reduction debate, with developed countries pointing to India and China and saying, you have to really ask them to join in the effort to reduce emissions. If not, we are not going to succeed in addressing the problem. Further, because it's going to create a competition gap, right, in which countries like United States, for instance, and Australia are going to lose out if they impose emissions reduction and India and China don't, right, in the form of all the companies going over to India and China. We will not agree to any legally binding emissions reduction unless India and China do the same. So over the period of time, what has emerged is that most countries have now agreed we cannot have binding legal obligations to reduce emissions in a strict sense. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to each make a voluntary commitment. We are going to say, we will commit to reduce our emissions by so much. And without getting into the climate change legal aspects of it, that has some benefits. It has had some kind of I think it's important and useful that the engagement is taking place. But the reality is, at the end of the day, if someone were to ask you, so where are we when it comes to legal commitments? We are wherever countries want to be. And if they choose not to be somewhere, there's very little one can do in the international realm to address that particular problem. So the question was, so what should India do? So one of the points or one of the thoughts that I had was, well, India is probably to a large extent rightfully, and especially in 2009, early 1990s, when you think about the context of India, is rightfully opposing, as former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi did at the Stockholm conference, rightfully saying, no, don't make this our problem. We still have the challenges of development, poverty, meeting infrastructure needs, and we are going to just focus on that. So don't ask us to do anything with respect to the environment unless you do something about it, because those countries, those industrialized nations that caused the problem should actually take the lead in this. Fair enough, except there is still this big problem, which is when the environmental crisis does unfold, and it's unfolding, right? It's unfolding in parts and pieces. When it unfolds, the people who will suffer are the very same people in India whom the government wants to promote, whom the government wants to see develop and come out of poverty. So in other words, the pace of development at this present time cannot happen at a rapid enough pace to prevent a lot of people from escaping environmental harms that will occur as a result. So the question is, what should be the right position that has to be taken by governments like India who have these dual challenges? And so the one question, one strategy, and that's already tried out in India and similar, in different other different jurisdictions, is to take a rights-based approach. So in India, where the environmental law and policy was pretty lax and really didn't have enough traction in the 1980s, for instance, the Supreme Court stepped in, and the Supreme Court, came up with a really interesting strategy, and that's of public interest litigation. So the Indian Supreme Court realized, and it recognized, that while we may have laws, while we may have constitutions, we still have a gap in terms of how people can reach remedies. People don't even know they have rights. People don't even know that there are laws protecting them. People don't have the financial means to hire a lawyer and file a complaint before the court. So it's fine to have the laws, but how do people access them? So the Supreme Court came up with this interesting jurisprudence where it said, well, instead of following the formalistic, writ filing procedures, we are going to just take up a case suo motu or on our own. So we will simply say, if we read something in the newspaper, or if somebody files a complaint to us or writes us a letter and says there's a human right violation happening in so-and-so community, much of that happened in the context of the right to life, which is enshrined in the Constitution, or which is provided in the Constitution of India, the court said, we will take up that case. So within that realm, one of the developments that occurred was the Supreme Court actually recognized that the right to life includes a right to a safe and sound environment. So environmental protection is part of India's right to life within the Constitution. So thinking through this particular idea, the next question was, so what next when it comes to international problems like climate change? Can some remedy be given to those people who will be left with the problems when it comes to all the environmental crisis? And the greatest challenge, of course, is, well, what can the Indian government do? So at that point particularly, and now with the emissions, as the emissions of India increases, the analysis could change. But at that point, the problem was, well, much of the emissions that are in the atmosphere didn't come from India. Right? Or if you have to take another country like Bangladesh to kind of make it easier to picture this, kind of situation, the people in Bangladesh, for instance, could say, Supreme Court of Bangladesh, which has also recognized your right to environmental protection, can you protect our environment? Can you protect our right? Can you give us remedies? And what would the Bangladesh Supreme Court do? Ask some other company in another country not to emit greenhouse gases? Ask, for instance, China or United States or Canada or Australia to say, do not emit greenhouse gases? That's not going to happen. It's jurisdictionally not possible. So the only way to address the problem would be through negotiations, right? So even though there's this right within the Constitution to a safe environment, to different conditions, health conditions, all of which are going to get affected by the developmental models and climate change, people don't have remedies. People in India would not have remedies locally or nationally against these problems. So the question is, where can the remedies come from? And we still have a kind of an open frame when it comes to that. But one of the movements that has started, and I think one of the areas that I think much of the focus has to, or probably would be productive to focus on, one of the areas that would be more productive to focus on would be human rights. But when you start thinking about human rights, of course, one of the classical questions has been, well, isn't that a Western liberal notion? And why is it that we should suddenly embrace human rights when you have so much, violations that have been created? So in that context, my research, and it's something that I'm carrying out right now in the process of, looking into this. I'm publishing smaller pieces on this. I started looking into the British, colonial influence in India. And one of the interesting threads I thought that emerged from my research was this, that first of all, the current trade or development that we see is not current or contemporary. It's actually a very time known or what do you say, long honed practice. So if you look at the British East India Company, which is considered one of the modern corporations of the world, its practice is pretty much what we see today. Maybe, the forms have changed, the context has changed because we don't have monarchies, we have republics, we have democracies, but the essence of it is that you have investors making investments in other parts of the world and bringing in the profits, creating goods and services in the process, and bringing back the profits to the investors. That's what the British East India Company did. The only difference is the British East India Company started doing this with the crown, with the permission from the crown. The crown had to give it the permission to do that. And what the British India Company did was commit a lot of atrocities. We talk about companies treating laborers badly today, not giving them all kinds of rights. But the British East India Company pretty much practiced something to that effect in those days. And I, for instance, was very taken by research that's out there on the great Bengal famine. When I read that some of the clerks in the British East India Company bought bags and bags of rice, even though they knew for decades, centuries, drought in the region was a problem. They bought bags and bags of rice and refused to sell them for a lower price when the drought hit. So people basically died because they couldn't afford to buy rice. And so that was the level of atrocities that was committed by the British East India Company. But what I thought was also interesting was there was a pushback against the practices of the British East India Company, not just in India, but in the British Parliament. So there were British parliamentarians who actually said you cannot allow a company to operate in India on these principles. You need to change how the British East India Company is operating in India, and you need to change the regime. So that did happen with eventually the British government getting into the country and the East India Company being sent out. But what's the story there? What is kind of like a common thread there in, that we can kind of gather? And the common thread is somehow this language of rights, right? Was not so much coming from the British government in the sense it was not the monarchy saying that, you British East India Company, you need to follow certain rights. That's my charter to you. But it was something that happened within the House of Commons, right, with the parliamentarians, which is still part of the British government, no doubt, but structurally came from people who felt, the notion of rights really is something deeper and far-reaching than just a government representation, that it needs to be taken across the border. It's not local, it's not national. And when you look at the research that out there, one of the arguments that I make is that, where did this concept of rights come from, even in Britain and other parts of the, in other Western societies? And really it comes from, a fight against the oppression that was taking place in each of these societies by a few people who wanted to control the resources, who wanted to control all the other aspects in that society. So the notion of rights is much more broader than the government. So to attach rights, which really is about the notion of how you treat people and what people can do with this notion of rights and where they stand in a society, to kind of conflate it with the government would defeat the entire foundation of rights itself. So to kind of put it all together in the British India context for a minute, another argument one can probably make, and I do make it, and I say probably because you're welcome to challenge this notion, of course, is that when you look at the Indian freedom movement, you see that a lot of the people who fought in the Indian freedom movement, whether it's Nehru or Gandhi or Ambedkar, all of these people were actually educated in England. They were mainly educated in the law. And so, coming back to this question of the language of the law, before the British, we had different legal systems. We had the Hindu legal systems, for instance, we had the Parsi legal systems, we had the, Muslim or Islamic legal systems, some of which are still, current, some of it changed, and that's a whole history in itself. But none of these, pre-British legal systems have the language of rights per se. They're all rooted in concepts of duty. They're all define specifically the relationship between the subjects and the kings. They define, how, conduct or behavioral codes, so to speak. And they had nothing to do with the kind of British legal system that emerged or that started, that took over the Indian subcontinent and much of or other parts of South Asia that were colonized by the British. So when the legal system or the prevailing legal system was replaced by the common law system and the British legal system, one of the main challenges was, well, how is that law created in India? And to some extent, it was created to keep people out of courts rather than in courts, right? So it was not providing access to a lot of the Indians against the very remedies. So if you look at how the freedom movement emerged and the role of rights, what you really see is a lot of these British educated lawyers realizing, with the support of a lot of Britishers in Britain, right, who supported this notion of independence in India, that you have rights, and these rights are not attached to the government. These are attached to the people, and which means that self-determination is one of the rights that need to be given to the people. Now, the way this whole thing played out is much more complex. It didn't play out in a court, for instance. The movement was pretty much violent. But the critical takeaway point is to associate human rights with any specific Western government, I think, is a missed opportunity, as well as a limited way of looking at human rights, because the human rights has always been about the people. It has always been about how to define the relationship between those who are governed and those who govern, and how we can make or hold those who govern us accountable and make them understand, at least in democracies, at least in functioning legal systems, how we can use that language to make sure that we reach common goals that are meaningful. Because at the end of the day, in democracies, at least, the idea of government is about the people agreeing to govern so that they can achieve certain common goals. So how do we connect all of this to the climate change debate or the environmental crisis that we face today, specifically with respect to India? So I think one of the ways in which the human rights lens can be very useful is to ask the question, let's forget about all these countries for a minute. Let's forget about representation of United States as United States, or India as India, or China as China in the international forum. And let's put at the center of this whole debate people, and ask the question, if what you needed to protect was the rights of the people that has been recognized for decades, even centuries now, how would you do it? How would you measure all the various measures that have been taken so far, the negotiations that's going on so far? How would you evaluate them? What would be your priority? Would it be to take over the same kind of development and say that, this is the only way that we can walk out of poverty? Or would it be to think about, are we repeating history over and over and over when we say that, because of our people, we need to develop, but the very people whom you want to develop for most of them will never see the benefits of this, but will be bearing the burden of that. So to kind of boil this down, the reason I think it's important to think about this in the colonial context is to, one, push back against this argument that, don't talk to us about rights. What did you do? But instead to say, yes, a lot of wrong things have been done in the past, but the language of rights, the use of rights has been instrumental, whether directly or indirectly, in framing and pushing back against those atrocities. So the rights language does not and should not be conflated with governments, because it takes away the very core of what rights are about. It's about the people. And two, if we can think about it and reconfigure or really look at rights in this way, can we then, kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and say, what would be the right thing to do by people? what is the right thing to do. And if you look at the historical evidence, how do you deal with issues of proper distribution? How do we make sure that there's some form of equity in how we look at development? And if we ask the question, let's look at all the countries that are developed and say, how is equity in those countries? Would we have a different outcome when it comes to environmental crisis and debates? And to put all these, the rights and that will be affected by environmental crises in the same platform, so that we can re-envision policies. So to conclude, kind of this connection between the past, present, and the future. We are not in a state of environmental crisis now. We've been in a state of environmental crisis that has been coming for many decades. And I think the way forward would be to think about it in the context of how we define or how we manage these crises from a human rights perspective. And I think efforts in this direction have already started. The United Nations Human Rights Commission recently adopted a resolution recognizing a right to a sound and safe environment. And there are efforts going on to do the same at the General Assembly level. And the climate change litigation that has occurred in different parts of the world have used the language of rights to try to get their governments to do more. So I think there's a momentum right now. The question is, of course, whether we can use it in countries like India to get meaningful outcomes for a country that is challenged by these contradictory and competing interests of development and environmental crises. I'll stop there. I don't know, I think I went a little over my time. I apologize, but I'm happy to answer any questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Badrinarayana, for such a fascinating conversation. And we will take all those questions. They keep rolling in. We'll take those after all of our presentations conclude. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Thomas Crowley.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much to Sarah Beckham and to Andrea Fowler for organizing all of this, bringing us all together. Also, yeah, just let me know if there's any issues with my audio. Speaking of climate change, I'm on the coastal belt of Maharashtra now, where there's been unusually intense periods of rain over an unusually short period of time, and it was just pouring, and now it's stopped again. So anyway, just let me know if there are any issues, and thanks so much to the other two speakers. And yeah, I think there's a lot of really rich interconnections, which I'm excited to get into in the Q&A. I'll just share my screen, share a slide. Okay. Right. So the title of my talk is Beyond Pristine Glory, the Long History and Uncertain Future of the Delhi Ridge. And the focus of this talk is really about how to conceptualize environment when we're thinking about urban spaces, and especially megacities. As more and more of the world's population is living in cities, this becomes an especially burning question, and I mean burning, pun I guess slightly intended, given recent events in Delhi. So I think maybe in a sort of common sense understanding, and certainly even in scholarship for a long time, the environment and cities were seen almost as opposed, as different things. I mean, the environment is wild nature, or maybe more rural areas. But at least for the past several decades, there's been a pushback against that, and there's been emerging fields like urban political ecology, urban environmental history, and those are fields that I try to draw on in this project. So the sort of case study of this is Delhi, but I hope that the questions this raises have more applicability in South Asia and beyond, to just how do we think about urban environments. So I wanted to start out and just take a little time to talk about how I came to this project and how it developed over time. As was mentioned in the introduction, I worked for an NGO in Delhi. This is a couple of years after graduating from college, and the NGO is actually part-time work, and then I had other part-time work. This is a random copy editing job, but it gave me the time and the sort of financial stability to do this research and to let it kind of meander and take different paths. And it started with just field visits to the Delhi Ridge. I'll share more as the talk goes on, but it's now known as the Green Lung of Delhi, and seen as perhaps an answer to some of its environmental problems. So I started visiting this space and started doing interviews with people, especially people who had been involved in the 1990s and later with an environmental campaign that they said is Save the Ridge, and particularly to save the forested areas of the ridge. And for reasons that I'll get into, I became more and more interested in history and sort of longer and longer terrains of history, and so that led me to the Delhi State Archives, looking at the British colonial period. But then really what a lot of my research ended up being was piecing together mentions from secondary sources, because I mean, Delhi not only as a huge megacity, but also as a city with millennia of history, has this immense body of scholarship on it. But at least until recently, there wasn't too much about Delhi's environments, or rather, maybe there was a lot about Delhi's environments, but it was hidden in books on political history, or books on biographies or memoirs or economic histories. So I felt a bit kind of like a magpie collecting all these little bits of one sentence from this book, one section of a chapter from this other book, and putting it all together. And then finally, I mean, something that actually began quite early in the process, but only deepened and got richer as the process of research and writing went on, was collaborating with the artist and illustrator Deepa. So the end product of this was a book, Fractured Forest, Quartzite City, and you're seeing this is the cover illustration for the book that Deepa prepared. That's loosely inspired by the neighborhood of Mehrauli in Delhi, which is where the Qutub Minar is, and also one portion of this forested zone called the Ridge. And for me, this book, the textual part of it is obviously important, but I feel like the images and the words go together to kind of convey both the thematics and also some of the arguments that the book is trying to make. So I thought that, so incidentally, this book was published in 2020, kind of, at one of the peaks in the academics. So I'm really glad to have the chance to sort of revisit this. I didn't get to do much of a launch or anything like that. So it's always nice to have these opportunities to talk a bit more about it. But I just wanted to read a bit from the introduction of the book, which kind of lays out sort of what I see as the stakes and some of the arguments. And I start by talking about what I see as what maybe one could call the paradox of Delhi, that it's the world's most polluted green city. It has the highest levels of air pollution in the world, at least according to much publicized 2014 World Health Organization findings. It's not just the air. Delhi has dangerously polluted water bodies, unnerving noise pollution, overflowing landfills, and mountains of electronic waste. And yet Delhi is also remarkably green, especially for a megacity with a population of 17 million as of the 2011 census. and this is almost certainly an underestimate. The city has an expansive network of small neighborhood parks and big public gardens. The centerpiece of Green Delhi is an 80 square kilometer zone that the government has set aside as reserve forest. This zone is clustered around the Aravalli Hills that cradle Mehroli and several other historic sites in Delhi. It is referred to colloquially as the Ridge. What exactly is the Ridge? This book is an attempt to answer this seemingly simple question. When I started researching the Ridge in 2010, I thought the answer too was simple. It's the city's green lung, its ecological lifeblood, a much needed forest in the midst of an ever expanding megacity. The newspaper reports I read gave a clear-cut account of the Ridge's benefits. It purifies Delhi's air, protects it from the hot desert winds of nearby Rajasthan, and provides an escape from the madness and speed of urban life. Because of its crucial ecological functions, the Ridge must be preserved, quote, in its pristine glory, to use the words of the government's master plan for Delhi. But this is not the full story. The more I learned about the Ridge, the more complexities I encountered. The seeds I had planted with my initial research began to put down tenacious roots and to sprout interlocking, entangled branches. The research project was becoming, I feared, an impenetrable thicket of ideas. A chief confusion was how to define the Ridge. Government reports and environmental groups have emphasized the Ridge's function as a forest. But the very name of the Ridge suggests that it is, at its core, a geological phenomenon. And indeed, most of the reserve forest zone in Delhi corresponds with the Aravalli Hills. And just to point to the illustrations here, these maps prepared by Deepa, the one on the left is more zoomed out, and it's basically showing the Aravalli mountain range, which starts in Gujarat and then goes through Rajasthan, parts of Haryana, and ends in Delhi. Although interestingly, actually, there's parts of it actually extend underground through into UP, but those parts are are covered by basically effluvial soil from the Himalayas. Since the Himalayas are much younger than the Aravallis are a bit submerged by features from the Himalayas. And then on the right-hand side, you see actually Delhi, and the sort of yellow is the national capital territory of Delhi with the Yamuna River passing through it. And you can see how the Aravallis enter and form. Basically, historians sometimes talk about the Delhi Triangle, which is the river on one side and the these two arms of the Aravallis, and that's where most of the historical cities of Delhi have been located. And so back to the introduction. So there is this correspondence between the reserve forest zone and the hills, but there are discrepancies. For instance, there are parts of the Delhi Aravallis that host no trees, and vice versa. There's parts of the forest that don't have hills. Poring over Ridge-related documents, I began to realize that phrases like pristine glory and the harmony of nature are serious impediments to understanding the Ridge, since they imply that both its ecology and geology have remained unchanged since time immemorial. The problem with this is not only centuries-old settlements like where Qutub Minar is. The problem is also that the forest itself, where it exists, is generally quite new and is dominated by invasive species. What is more, the densest stands of present-day forest are largely located on a pockmarked landscape where, for many decades, quarrying gashed holes in the hills. The problem, in short, is history. To evoke a timeless balance of nature on the Ridge is to erase its history. But it is precisely in the realm of history that one can discover how the Ridge's geology and ecology have co-evolved, and even more crucially, how the Ridge and the city of Delhi have shaped each other over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. My aim then is to recover the lost history of the ridge, and in the process, to tell a story of Delhi that puts its environment front and center. While there has been no dearth of writing on Delhi, the city's chroniclers often ignore its ecological features. But Delhi looks different when viewed from the height of its hills, or from the depths of its old mining pits, or from the thickets of its newly grown woodlands. So I'll stop the reading there and move on to the next slide, which is another illustration prepared by Deepa. And basically the next section of the introduction, which I won't read the full thing because I'll use all my time that way. But the next section is basically this kind of whirlwind tour where I actually start backwards. So I start at the present day, which everyone kind of agrees everything's degraded, everything's polluted. But then going back to different periods of time to show that in none of these times was there some pristine, unchanging sort of permanent landscape. And what's really nice about this illustration too is Deepa has done each of these in a different style. So the kind of British colonial period is in this sort of modernist town planning style. The Mughal period mimics some Mughal art forms and even evoking sort of cave paintings. So obviously when you get further and further back into history, the actual sources are much more speculative, but I mean across northern India there's evidence of basically hunter-gatherer societies using hunting and hunting megafauna. And then with the Neolithic Revolution and with the growth of pastoralism, the use of fires to transform the landscape. And, this goes back tens and thousands of years. So this idea of returning to some sort of eternal balance of nature becomes a bit tricky. So if that's the kind of story that I'm arguing against, and in the introduction I spent some time saying why this phrase sort of pristine glory, even if it's used in these planning documents in a sort of rhetorical way, even if it's not meant literally, I feel like its sort of impact is a resting thought. Once you hear that, it doesn't lead you to want to know more about the history, or it doesn't lead you to want to know more about how did we get to where we are today. So if I'm not telling that story, then what am I doing? I mean, I don't want to write a whole book that's just criticizing this idea. I want to be telling a different kind of a story. And so I actually came to geography quite late. Now I'm in a geography PhD program. But I think sort of intuitively as I was working on this project, as I was gathering more material, certain ideas of space and of urban space started to resonate with me. And I found, maybe I only found the language of it, maybe even after the book was published, as I started reading more in geography and these influential theorists of space. But for instance, I mean, just these phrases I really like. Dorian Massey, a British geographer and scholar, talks about space as a simultaneity of stories so far. And, this I think is especially true in urban spaces, but any space, Yosemite, a national park, for instance, or a farm anywhere in the world, or a city anywhere in the world. You just think of all of the stories, and some of those are geological stories that unfold over the course of, say, 1 billion years in the case of the Aravallis. Some of those are extremely new, a migrant that just arrived last week to a city or to work on a farm in upstate New York. So you have all of these different temporal trajectories that are converging on a particular space. And I think resonant with that is the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre's description, where he says that space is a structure far more reminiscent of flaky pastry than of the homogeneous space of classical mathematics. So this pastry, I mean, I'm imagining a croissant where, you cut it open and you see all these layers. It's not neatly divided. They're all merging into each other. They're all blending. And I think just on the basis of these quotes, one could get the sense that, oh, it's sort of this happy coexistence. You have all these things blending together. But both of these authors, in different ways, and their arguments are different, their politics are also different. But both of them are very keenly aware of power and the way that power plays out over space. So it's not necessarily a happy, coexistence of stories so far. Some stories may dominate over others. The story of pristine glory, if it dominates, what effects does it then have? So, for instance, what Massey says is that space is always riven with power geometries, and you don't necessarily know what those geometries are before you enter a space. But that's precisely the work of research, and the work of also political struggle and political coalition building and all of those things, is figuring out where those power geometries are and where maybe one can intervene and promote both a more egalitarian and a more, you could also say, ecologically just set of power geometries. So if that's the kind of theory, which maybe I didn't even have fully formed when I was writing the book, still that leaves the question of what are the layers, what are the stories, what are the layers of this pastry of Delhi that I'm trying to weave together. So I want to just very briefly run through the 5 chapters of the book, not the chapters themselves or their content, but really their thematics. And of course, there's many different ways to talk about Delhi, and there have been many ways to talk about it. But for me, just given the material I gathered, this seemed to me at least one interesting way of putting this together. So the introduction is what I read to you from, kind of playing with this metaphor of seeds and planting the seeds of the research. But the first substantive chapter is called Stones, and that's looking at geological history, again with this idea that the ridge in its very name is geology, and that is, goes back to the formation of the Aravallis roughly 1 billion years ago, but also even in the present day, and also in the colonial period, the stones of the ridge were extremely important for the construction industry. And if you think about a city of 17 million people, and now buildings largely being concrete, and for concrete you need sand or something like sand. So there's this quartzite stone of the Aravallis. It's the main type of stone, is quartzite. But when it degrades over time, or when it sort of disintegrates, it forms this sand, which is used extensively in Delhi, and it's called Badrpur sand because it's largely found in Badrpur, which is on the ridge. So these kind of formations, which it took maybe millions of years for this particular piece of quartzite to dissolve in this particular way, but then it feeds into for instance economic liberalization and the way that spurred particular construction booms in Delhi. So the first chapter looks at that. You could say broadly geology, but geology in the way that it intersects with many other fields. The second, this is a typo. Yeah, the second chapter 2 should be soil. This is what happens 2 years after publication. Things start to fade a bit. But chapter 2 is soil. So this is basically ecology, ecological history, but also ecological history in a way that weaves together the human and the non-human. And I think it becomes, especially in a city, it becomes very easy to separate those things. There's the sort of human life, but then there's the trees or the monkeys, for instance, or the goats, or any of the things you see in this illustration. But really through the narration of this chapter, trying to show the ways that both human and non-human have, in different ways and in different historical time periods, really transformed the ridge and the city. The third chapter is state, so looking at political history, and since, almost a millennium, Delhi has been an important political center, and sort of the building of Qutb Minar, for instance, is a very appropriate symbolic marker. Qutb Minar is the most visited tourist site in Delhi, and that's at one point in the country. I don't know if that statistic still holds up, but basically this, this huge minaret, very beautiful structure. But since then, that's sort of planting this flag of Delhi being a state capital. And then the state, of course, changes hugely over time, but interacts in different ways with both the geology, so chapter 1, and with the ecology. So with the geology, it's, for instance, the way that the state intervened in the quarrying industry, and how they also deregulated that industry over time and the effects of that. And then with the ecology, I mean, it's the state that decides what is a reserved forest. And interestingly, the way that these British laws also get continued into contemporary times, the declaring of a zone as a reserved forest has really nothing to do with ecology, or needn't. So, I mean, there's zones, when the ridge was declared as a reserved forest, it was not, there was no forest there. There were no real trees. But the government decided, for reasons that we can get into if people are interested, that it wanted it to be a forest, and so it's a forest. The fourth chapter, surplus, is looking at economy, basically production, consumption. So the production, I think I've already hinted at with things like quarrying and the real estate industry, but also, especially since the 90s, the ridge has been a site of conspicuous consumption, farmhouses, which is sort of a euphemism for these like huge mansions, swimming pools, wedding complexes. That's proliferated on some parts of the ridge, and why those parts and not other parts also has their reasons. Obviously, state and economy are tied together in very intimate ways. So again, it's, if we're thinking of the flaky pastry, these layers are really merging and melding into each other. And the final chapter is called Spirits. And in some ways, it's about religion and the practice of religion, but it's all more broadly about ideas of transcendence, which may be very secular also. So for instance, college kids going into the ridge to smoke pot or to drink, or lovers who don't have a place to go because they're living with their parents, or it's their parents don't approve. So all of these, but then also, I mean, more traditionally religious, there's Sufi shrines, there's many temples, and particular sects that have particular histories that I would, or that I do argue are more heterodox, so different tantric traditions, and even Sufism as being, not the most orthodox kind of interpretation of Islam, and maybe there being reasons that they seek out these quote unquote wild spaces, these forested spaces. But then also that obviously intersects with state. Does the state, what is its relationship with these different religious sects, with economy? Some of these spaces are also doubling as they're renting rooms to people. So I mean, how does this all work? Who's allowed to encroach, who's not? So all of these really come together. And so this is the final chapter, and in the end of it, I also try to a little bit weave some of these threads together and see what that might mean, and what are the sort of more apocalyptic visions for the ridge, which I think if you were in Delhi in the spring, you would see very clearly. But also what are potentially avenues that could be built on. And in the last few minutes I have, I'll skip this slide. I want to talk about why does it matter? Kind of what are the political stakes of a story that foregrounds pristine glory versus one that's more historically attuned. So there's a community that I talk about. It's a indigenous or Adivasi community called the Odes. It's in English, it's usually translated just as OD, but sometimes ODH. And they, some people from the Ode community crossed into, they're mostly in Pakistan, or what is now Pakistan, but some parts of the community came to what is now India during partition. And traditionally they work with water, so digging wells, canals, check dams, basically what is sometimes described as indigenous knowledge systems around water management. but also, I mean, in Delhi, then, you know, they're like building, you know, digging lines for cables and now for internet lines and all of that, just because they have those skills passed down for generations of working with earth and also working with water. And so they worked in one of the quarries on the ridge. And at some point, when you're this kind of sort of open quarrying, you just go down, 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 down until you hit water, and then you basically can't quarry anymore. And as that was happening in this particular place, basically in Badrpur, which I mentioned, there were also increasing sort of environmental voices saying this quarrying is environmentally damaging. And sort of for various reasons, it was decided to stop quarrying, both for economic viability reasons, but also these increasing environmental voices. And this got converted into a Solarabhakti wildlife sanctuary. It used to be the Bhakti mines. And then along with that, I mean, a few years after that, then these workers' colonies, which had been supported by the government, suddenly the government said these people are encroaching. These workers, their worker, you know, settlements are basically encroachments, and they should be demolished because they're, you know, in the way of this reserve forest. And basically due to various, and if one takes a sort of pristine glory view, the ridge needs to be preserved in its pristine glory, as the master plan says, then there's some logic to that. You know, why are these working class settlements encroaching into the wildlife sanctuary? But basically what the Ode said, I mean, one, they said, you know, we were brought here basically by the government to work on these lands. How can you kick us out? And successfully fought their displacement. But recently, they've also been using the Forest Rights Act, which, again, going to questions of legislation and rights and the language of rights. So the Forest Rights Act is basically being used by various indigenous communities to claim ownership, often collective ownership of land. And this is an extremely innovative use, what the Odes are doing. It's one of two cases that it's been used in urban areas that I know. This is also, the research is a couple of years old now, but also in Mumbai at the national park there's been similar efforts. So I think, that's a half hour. Anyway, so I think some of these efforts in Mumbai, in Delhi, show what the creative use of environmental legislation and views of the environment that recognize these simultaneity of stories, views of the environment that recognize, I mean, what some of the representatives of the Ode say, which is, I mean, 100% true, is we've been here longer than the forest has been. You know, we came here when this was a quarrying pit. And whatever afforestation has been going on has happened after we got here. So why don't you include us? Why don't you give us jobs as forest rangers? Why don't you give us jobs, you know, planting trees? So when I'm saying all of this about, you know, being very critical of this language of pristine glory, it's not saying that, oh, the ridge isn't important. I mean, of course, I think it's important. This forested land is also extremely important for a city like Delhi. But the question becomes, how do you then manage that land? How do you manage it in a just way, in a way that doesn't involve, for instance, slum demolitions, which has been that has happened in Delhi, given for many reasons, but it has increasingly from the 90s onwards under the sort of guise of environmentalism. I mean, but then what kind of environmentalism is that? And do we have other environmental language we can use? And I concluded with this example because I do think there is, I mean, I think it's emerging. I think the dominant environmentalism in Delhi specifically is the sort of pristine glory one. And the question is, how do you contest that? And I think that's very much a work in progress. Yeah, thank you so much. I look forward to the Q&A. Incidentally, this is after the illustrations I want to show actually a photograph. This is from Maroli with part of the South Central Ridge in the background. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists.